I'd like to flag that the lead essay in FPA's annual Great Decisions briefing book, which comes out next month, is on Russia and the near abroad. How to respond to Mr. Putin's growing insistence on preserving the former Soviet area as a zone of privileged Russian interest. With the benefit of hindsight, the reset may have given rise to unrealistic expectations for better relations between the United States and Russia. To take stock and to look ahead, we are fortunate to have with us some of this country's foremost experts on Russia. Dr. Angela Stent, Director of the Center for Eurasia, Russia and Eastern European Studies at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, has just published a compelling book, The Limits of Partnership, U.S.-Russian Relations in the 21st Century. Dr. Celeste Wallander is Senior Director for Russia and Asia on the National Security Council staff and previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia. Ambassador John Beyrle was U.S. Ambassador to Russia from 2008 to 2012 and was presented by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton with the State Department's highest honor, the Secretary's Distinguished Service Award. And now to moderate this outstanding panel, I am pleased to turn to Susan Glasser, editor of Politico and former editor-in-chief of the journal Foreign Policy. Susan?
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you and to the World Affairs Council for having us. Can you hear me?
He controls it. You got it.
Okay, let's try it now. Can you hear me?
Turn it up.
All right, one more time. All right, excellent. It's too early in the morning. I hope everybody has lots of coffee. No, thank you very much to the World Affairs Council, because I have to say it's a privilege for me and a treat to spend some time listening to three of the smartest people that I know about Russia at a time when it really matters. So I think we'll just jump right in. Luckily enough, it turns out that one of our panelists, Angela, has just come back from this very fascinating annual ritual of the Valdai Discussion Club, where she heard President Vladimir Putin give quite an extraordinary rant against the United States and our various sins. And I thought we'd start out with a little bit of ground truth to get us going on this subject of Russia and America and what can we do.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm delighted to be here. I've been going around and speaking to various World Affairs Councils in different parts of the country, and you really are a wonderful group. I will start with a small anecdote. My book, the title is The Limits of Partnership. It's coming out in Russian in a couple of months. And my publishers just sent me the front cover to look at, and the title on that cover was Why America Doesn't Listen to Russia. So I wrote politely back to them and said, I don't really think that reflects what I have in my book. It's more complicated. Anyway, it's fine now. We worked out a compromise, but that just shows it. So as Susan said, I've been part of a group which for the last 11 years, it's a group of foreign experts on Russia, has met with President Putin and other Russian officials. This year, we were in a beautiful hotel, 4,000 feet up above Sochi, where the Olympic Games were held in the beautiful Caucasus Mountains. And the hotel was actually built for the G8 summit, of course, that never was. So I think we were some of the first guests there. Let me just tell you some of the themes that emerged from our discussion, and that's with different Russian officials, with Russian participants from different walks of life. And the first theme that we heard from all of the Russian officials was everyone is united behind President Putin. The Western actions against Russia have made us stronger, more united, and that President Putin will be in office for another 10 years. And there was some question about, it wasn't clear what would happen afterwards. And so that was a major theme. Then the Deputy Chief of Staff, and this was leaked to the Russian press, went as far as saying that Putin is Russia, and Russia is Putin, and without Putin, there is no Russia. So that again was a very strong message. On the sanctions, we heard from different officials that they were illegal, that yes, there was a little pain involved, but actually they were very good for Russia because it would force Russia to reorient its economy in such a way that it would not be vulnerable to these sanctions anymore. And it was time to create a new global financial system. In fact, the theme of the conference was the need for a new global order. The theme was that the post-Cold War order, which had been really dictated according to the Russians by the United States, was broken. It was no longer functioning, and that we had to move on to something where the United States played a lesser role. The Russians stressed very much the Russian-Chinese connection. Interestingly enough, some of the Chinese participants said, no, 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 you know, we don't want to take over this new global role. And one Chinese participant stood up and said, we want more US leadership. But I think he was the only one there who said that. And then you can watch President Putin's speech, you can read it. It really was a very strident speech. It was reminiscent of the one that he made in Munich in 2007, but if you like, more so. The United States is responsible for all the problems in the world. We've helped create the Islamic State, according to him, because of our actions supporting the Mujahideen during the Afghan war, because of what we did in Iraq, because of what we've done in Syria, because of what we've done in Libya. So very strong condemnation of that. And we're responsible for support for, quote unquote, neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And I have to say, any discussion that were there on Ukraine, both formally and less formally, it was very hard to have a civilized discussion because the Russian version of the facts differs dramatically from the US or the European understanding of what the facts are. And therefore, the basis for dialogue, I would say, is very flimsy. So all in all, it was was a pretty depressing picture. So then, in Russia, you always ask two questions when you have a problem. One of them is who is guilty, and then the other one is what shall we do? And so the who is guilty was clear from everything that we heard. But what is to be done, I think, is much less evident. And I think from the US point of view, there are several choices, none of them are very great. I mean, obviously we have a sanctions regime, it's inflicting economic pain, but it hasn't really changed Russia's policy, particularly in the Ukraine crisis. We are now faced with a frozen conflict, essentially, in eastern Ukraine. Russia and the separatists have created new facts on the ground, and the issue is, how do you move beyond that? We have a government in Ukraine, it's probably the best government that Ukraine's had in the past 22 years. We've had parliamentary elections, presidential elections, but huge challenges for the Ukrainians. So I think I would just leave it, what are our choices? One of the choices, which of course would be very difficult, would be to say ultimately these are new facts on the ground. They were created by Russia, for whom what happens in Ukraine is more important than it is either for the Europeans or for the United States, just given history and geography, and therefore maybe we have to accept this and move on, find a different way to work with Russia, since we do have to work on issues like Iran and Syria and counterterrorism. And another answer would be we have to continue, the current sanctions regime. We have to continue pushing on Russia, and this could mean a further deterioration in the relationship. So fortunately, we have someone who is working in the White House who can tell us more about that. But certainly coming away from this meeting and listening to President Putin and to the other officials, I would say this is certainly the lowest point in the relationship since before Mikhail Gorbachev came to power.
So it's a cheery outlook, is what you're saying. No, we're talking about Russia. So Celeste, you do have a unique vantage point, both as a career Russia watcher and being inside the administration when it's faced with the choice of how to respond to these actions. There's been a lot of debate here in the United States around that Russian question of Kto vinovat, who is to blame. And I've been struck by the fact in recent months, as this debate has raged here in the United States, that there are many people who feel that somehow the United States may have triggered this very aggressive response by Vladimir Putin, that it's somehow because of decades of U.S. triumphalism after the Cold War, that it has to do with NATO expansionism. What is your view of the role that the United States has played in Russia's grievances.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks. First, let me thank the World Affairs Council for inviting me to speak. It's really an honor, and it's a pleasure because, as my friends and colleagues know, I don't get out a lot, and I don't get to see them as often as I would like. So it's really great to see Susan and John, and to be able to talk with John and Angela and all of you. So thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. I think it's important to not be defensive and to always be willing to reevaluate and understand your role and your actions, and to be mindful of the unintended consequences and certainly the intended consequences of your foreign policies and your diplomacy and your interaction. But if you go back and look at the facts, which there is not enough done, in talking about this crisis, if you go back and look at the facts at how this crisis emerged, it helps you understand what is at stake. The crisis emerged over Ukraine signing a free trade association agreement with the European Union. NATO membership was not on the table. Ukraine had taken it off the table. No one thought Ukraine was ready for or interested in or on the brink of NATO membership. In the months leading up to February, when the Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, ran away, he left his post, and then it turns out he was spirited off to Moscow, which President Putin said in Valdai, after Russia had denied it for some time. The United States was working with President Yanukovych. Vice President Biden spoke many times, I'm now forgetting the exact number, I believe it was 11 times, with President Yanukovych to help try to mediate an agreement between the government in place and the protesters out on the streets, who were simply trying to press for President Yanukovych to do what he had promised he had done when he was elected, which was to conclude an agreement between Ukraine and Europe for free trade, for opening Ukrainian trade to Europe, for improving the investment climate, for finding a way for Ukraine to take the next step towards economic growth, and also visa-free travel, the kinds of things that Ukrainians aspire to, and which actually most Russians aspire to. Russians like traveling to Europe. Russians want to see their economy grow. So what was a quintessentially non-zero-sum, sort of win-win kind of opportunity for Ukraine got turned by the Russian government into a zero-sum confrontation and direct intervention by the Russian government, political, economic, and then finally military, to prevent the Ukrainian people from making their own choice. So what is at stake in this crisis isn't, in a sense, it's not Ukraine, although I have great affection for Ukraine and have spent a lot of time there, including in Sevastopol, which someday I hope to be able to visit again when it once again belongs to Ukraine. But what is at stake is exactly following the rules of the international system, not changing borders by force, respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries in Europe. One of the justifications that President Putin has given for what he has done in Ukraine, seizing Crimea, intervening in eastern Ukraine, in a conflict that is now upwards of 4,000 people have died, most recently 2 teenage boys on a soccer field who were trying to escape the conflict with a little bit of soccer and instead were killed when the soccer field they were playing on was shelled. So one of the reasons that President Putin has given for this is that historically Crimea was Russian. Well, actually, historically Crimea belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and Kaliningrad historically belonged to Germany. Karelia historically belonged to Finland, and the Kuril Islands historically belonged to Japan. So, in fact, one of the countries in the international system that most benefits from the international order, from respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of neighbors, and for negotiating and resolving differences politically instead of militarily, is the Russian Federation. And so that's what's at stake in this crisis, is the international order and the respect that countries have to show for one another in order to make sure that we don't have militarized conflict. And that's the reason for the sanctions regime, not because we like using sanctions, not because we want to hurt the Russian people, but because we want to make clear to the Russian leadership that the path that is chosen is the wrong path and will bring greater cost to Russia than Russia is seeking to impose on Ukraine. And it's extremely important that this point be made now, because if we don't stop with Ukraine and find a way to get a political resolution that restores the ability of the Ukrainian people to make their own choices for their own future, what about Moldova, where there's also Russian military presence? Will we see a reemergence of conflict with Georgia? There are ethnic Russians in the Baltic states, and the Baltic states are members of NATO. And the United States has an Article 5 commitment to the security of the Baltic states, as does all of Europe. So we need to make this clear now, and the door remains open to a political resolution. President Putin himself proposed what became the Minsk Protocol of September 5th. But Russia has not implemented the elements of the Minsk Protocol yet. In order to remove the sanctions, as President Obama has made clear, all Russia has to do is live up to its commitments under the Minsk Protocol, and we can get on the track to a political resolution of this crisis and back to a global order that protects Russia every bit as much as it protects Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Celeste. I'm going to push back just for 1 second before I get to Ambassador Beyrle. But Russia has this sense of grievance. President Putin has articulated it, not just in this crisis, but actually really throughout his rule of Russia. He, at various points, has made clear he sees Russia as the victim of a hostile sort of Western encirclement. Do you discount that altogether? How do you factor that in, putting your Kremlinologist hat on?
No, I think your analysis is right. And one of the challenges we have now is that the Russian information space is so devoid of debate, discussion, the ability to bring independent information and facts to the table, that it's very hard to have that conversation with the Russian leadership. There are academic studies which demonstrate that, for example, Europe and the United States back in 1989 and 1990 did not make any commitment not to expand NATO in exchange for German unification. There was a specific commitment to not move NATO military forces to Eastern Germany, but there is absolutely no evidence that whatsoever that that was part of the agreement. There is evidence that Soviet leaders sought that, but there is no evidence that they achieved it because that was viewed as unacceptable. It just wasn't, agreed to. But that hasn't stopped the narrative in Russia. If you ask Russians, they will tell you that there was such a promise, for example. And so it is extremely difficult to have conversations with the Russian leadership and the Russian people because of what's going on domestically inside of Russia to cut off the internet to information, recent trends in legislation that make it, for example, if you're a blogger and 3,000 people visit your site, you then have to register with the Russian government so that they can watch your site and what you're putting on the site. Can you imagine 3,000 people visiting your site? It is an incredibly onerous set of regulations that are meant to ensure that the Russian government controls the information space so that you can't have a debate about these grievances and a willingness to engage in a legitimate discussion about addressing concerns that the Russian government may have.
Well, it is ironic that we're having this conversation, exactly 25 years to the day since the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was viewed as a triumphant moment here in Washington, but was one of the most traumatic events in Vladimir Putin's life. Putin, of course, was a consul, isolated, in fact, relegated to a second-tier spying post in Dresden, East Germany, and has, in his one account, basically his campaign biography, talked about that basically as the day that he understood that everything he had believed in was wrong. That basically they wired to Moscow for instructions, and Moscow didn't answer, and that was the phrase that stuck with him. Ambassador Beyrle, you were in Russia at a time that now seems almost like a historical relic, the period of the reset and seemingly a good relationship that President Obama was seeking to forge in the aftermath of probably the low point at the end of the Bush administration. So you saw both of those things. Did Vladimir Putin change, or was he always this way and we just didn't see it?
Well, the history of U.S.-Russia and U.S.-Soviet relations is really characterized by incredible swings, ups and downs, periods of booms and busts, with Berlin and the Cuban Missile Crises being followed by détentes and resets. The problem with these up periods is not that they don't produce lasting results. Just the most recent reset between 2008 and 2010 gave us a new arms control agreement, arms control inspections, and a very robust Russian program helping us supply our forces in Afghanistan. The problem with the resets and the détentes is that they never last very long. And the challenge is always to keep the good things going, to find an agenda where Russia and America can agree we have common interests, even at a time that we're arguing about some other fairly significant things. We managed to do that during the time of the reset, during the time of détente, because we had an agreed agenda to move forward. In the case of détente, obviously, it was disarmament. In the case of the reset, it was getting Russia into the WTO. It was helping resupply our forces in Afghanistan. I think the problem that I see in the relationship now is I don't see the positive agenda anymore. Yes, we are continuing to cooperate on arms control, but we can't really agree on the next steps. We can't keep the process going that started under Gorbachev and Reagan and even before that. And we're really not talking strategically about what happens after we pull out of Afghanistan. Russia has a deep, vital interest in stability in that near neighboring country. And yet, and we and the Russians have a lot to talk about, and yet we're not really doing that. We're at a historically, I would say, almost unprecedented period in our relationship where both the quality and the quantity of the interactions between the countries at the level of top leaders and even at just the level of everyday governance is about as low as I can remember it. And that's something that really both sides need to work on, but it really does need to start at the top. And I'm hopeful that Celeste will tell us that there is at least some chance that there'll be a discussion of some kind between President Putin and President Obama when they meet in Australia in just a couple of days or a week.
Celeste?
Not just in Australia, but in Beijing for APEC.
Yeah.
There is no formal meeting planned, but there was no formal meeting planned at Normandy in France, and the presidents had some opportunity for some conversation. So I can't. It could happen, but it's not on the formal agenda right now.
And if I can just jump in, that's part of the problem, and I'm not saying it's our fault. I mean, I know, made some outreach to the Russian side, which hasn't been reciprocated. But the idea of just putting the two leaders together in a pretty unstructured environment without the benefit of discussions that should take place ahead of time to set up a few key things that they might agree on that could change the dynamic a little bit is, again, I think just a symptom of how far we've fallen in the relationship in a short time.
Susan, can I just add something to your question about grievances? I think we all have to remember that a lot of what we hear of all the criticism of the United States, of all the grievances, of looking back in anger, so to speak, also has a very important domestic aspect to it. In 2011, people were out in the streets demonstrating against President Putin when he announced his job switch. This really rattled a number of people's nerves to understand that people went out in the streets. Of course, at that point, Prime Minister, as he then was, Putin blamed Secretary Hillary Clinton for paying everyone to go out in the streets. But his popularity numbers were much lower. The invasion of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, and all of the sort of hype about what's happening in Ukraine, as you know, his numbers are now, poll numbers are in the 80s. I mean, it's a little bit softer when you ask people, would you vote for him again? But right now, in terms of, you know, how popular he is, so that blaming the United States for everything, blaming the West, has helped him. And it also enables him, you know, if people do start to feel the economic pinch, which they are and will, you again blame both external and internal enemies. And that's the other new cast of this, the so-called fifth columnist within Russia, and it comes back to questions of the internet and everything else, who are apparently doing the bidding of the United States. So I think we have to see this also very much in domestic terms as well.
Well, what's striking about that, right, is that that's where there's so many echoes of the Soviet past, you know, in terms of almost the harnessing of a nationalist ideology as well into Putinism, which is very different than the Putin who talked in his first term, I think, about a different kind of engagement with the West. So he's reverted to certain tried and true methods. But I want to get back to his engagement or lack thereof with the United States. Russia plays this role internationally in the Security Council. It's at the table in talks that are ongoing with Iran. Right now, there's a deadline of November 24th to see if we can move forward to a deal. Celeste, I know you can't talk in great detail about that, but to what extent has there been at least an ability to silo this crisis? There is a sense I get that Russia is still more or less engaged in the Iran talks, for example. There was a meeting the other day with Secretary Kerry and some conversation, I believe, about Syria. How does it work? Is it possible, really, to be, on the one hand, confronting Russian aggression in Ukraine, and on the other hand, working with them on Iran?
Well, it's not only possible, but it's exactly what we're doing. You know, there are intensive negotiations on Iran and very consistent meetings of the P5+1, which means Russia and the United States. There are not just ongoing, but very intensive discussions about Syria. There was the successful completion of the removal and destruction of Syrian chemical weapons, which was a multinational effort, but included Russia and required close coordination with Russia. There is absolutely ongoing implementation of arms control agreements and all kinds of nuclear safety day-to-day programs. So the work goes on, but it may not always get public attention, and it may not be sort of the kind of diplomacy that, you know, gets headlines. But work where we have global responsibilities and core security interests goes on, continues to go on. And in my view, I think what we see is that Russia shares a sense of those responsibilities and shares the view of outcomes that allows it to cooperate. We've been able to continue with that cooperation almost seamlessly. I mean, it's not as if it's, I mean, some of the conversations are tough because they do range across the whole bilateral relationship. Secretary Kerry meets and talks quite regularly with Foreign Minister Lavrov. But other officials do meet and talk with their counterparts because we have important work to do.
Angela, when you were in Valdai, you described this moment where a senior Kremlin official basically said Putin is Russia and Russia is Putin, which of course is the terrifying echo of what was once said about Adolf Hitler. You've watched many different Soviet and Russian leaders. What is your view of Vladimir Putin? I mean, do you believe that he is just sort of modern-day Stalin, using targeted crackdowns on the internet as opposed to mass roundups in the Gulag? Do you see him as primarily a KGB agent who's taken on the ultimate role? What is your assessment of him?
Who is Mr. Putin? You know, it's these historical analogies, you have to be very careful with them. And obviously there are examples from Russia's past where you had authoritarian leaders. I think what you have to understand, and you started to get at it, here is a man who devoted his life in his younger years to working for the KGB, who believed in all of the, you know, the ideals of the Soviet Union and what it represented, who had this very traumatic experience in East Germany, in Dresden, in 1989, when, as you say, they came, the crowds after the Berlin Wall came down, came and wanted to get all the documents from the East German secret police that were co-located at that point with the KGB, that they had to burn documents, and that, as you say, he called Moscow and he didn't get any response. And that's all, of course, in his memoirs. So I think the collapse of the Soviet Union, was not only a political problem, but obviously it had personal resonance for him because of his own position there. And then I think the other thing that clearly made a major impression on him, he did work as the deputy mayor in St. Petersburg in the early 1990s, responsible for foreign economic contacts. And then he saw what happened when you had sort of competitive elections, and Mayor Sobchak, for whom he worked, was then defeated in what, by all accounts, was not a very clean election. So the kind of experience of the 90s in terms of what do competitive elections mean, and then seeing the economic problems that Russia had, culminating in the 1998 crash. So I think when he says this, I think he sincerely means it, that for him the 1990s was a period of chaos, it was a period of economic decline, and it was a period where the United States imposed an agenda on Russia, a foreign policy agenda, because Russia was weak and it was still trying to find out what it wanted to do. And he certainly believes that it has been his mission to restore a strong Russia, to reject the idea that Russia has to respond to a US agenda, and of course in terms of the economy, recapturing the commanding heights of the economy where the state has much more control now. But now I think we're in a period where, as Celeste was saying, there are increasing crackdowns on the internet. They're now threatening Memorial, which is a very well-respected organization that existed since the Soviet collapse, to sort of examine Russian history and the crimes of Stalin, and to come to terms with this and make Russians aware of their own history. There was an interesting article in the New York Times, last Sunday, about how the school textbooks are now all, there's only one line. There are no competitive school textbooks anymore. There are only certain things you're allowed to say. They've tried to crack down on what academic historians do. So all of this obviously gives the sense of trying to recreate, a much more authoritarian state. And then some of it is about staying in power. So, maybe I'll just finish by saying, after listening to some of the things we heard in the Valdai conference, obviously people started to discuss, well, what happens in 10 years' time? How does the succession evolve? What plans are there? And of course, nobody knows about that, but that injects, this element of uncertainty and into the political system, which again, I think should give the outside world some cause for concern.
So, Ambassador Beyrle, what is your view of Vladimir Putin? Do you see him as a Soviet without the ideology?
Well, I think there's a lot of demonization of Putin that takes place in the US media that really worries me a lot. Not to say that Putin hasn't earned his share of criticism for the things we talked about earlier, the annexation of Crimea, the crackdown on dissent. None of these are taking Russia in the direction that a lot of Russians want to see the country go. Mm-hmm. And I worry a little bit also that you paint a picture of Russia in which control over information seems a little more total than it actually is on the ground. I read the Russian blogs a lot. I'm probably one of these 3,000.
Getting people in trouble, are you?
Getting people in trouble. But it's really quite remarkable. The internet in Russia is not censored to the degree that the Chinese are trying to censor it. It doesn't mean that they're not trying. But this is a much larger debate as to whether you're actually going to be able to control information in the way that some of the people making the decisions in the Kremlin would like to control it. And I think that's very important because there are alternative views, as there were alternative views during the Soviet period. During the Soviet period, and I lived in Russia, a lot of us lived in Russia during those Soviet days, there was a lot of free debate that went on, but it took place over kitchen tables. It took place with lowered voices. Now that debate takes place much more in the open. It's in a restricted space called the internet, which most Russians don't get their news from. And yet if you read the internet, if you read the blogs, you'll discover a lot of Russians who are very concerned about what Putin has done just in the last 2 years. I read something earlier this week in which a very well-known blogger who has a lot of followers said Putin made essentially 3 strategic mistakes for Russia. with this Ukrainian adventure. First of all, he alienated the bulk of Ukrainians against Russia, which had never been the case. Number two, he reawakened NATO, which this blogger said had been like a dog dozing by the fire, and Putin made it sit up and bark. And number three, Putin united the Europeans on a view of Russia that was more negative than positive, and that is really unprecedented since the fall of the Soviet Union. So there are a lot of people inside of Russia who don't see what's happening as obviously good for their country, but also don't see it as something that they need to sit down and be quiet about. And I think that's a very important point, because Russia has changed tremendously in the last 20 years in terms of being open to the outside world in a way that's never been the case in its history.
Can I just, I think what the point John has made is extremely important, which is we see these statistics that Putin has 80% or 86% approval rating, and there's two things I'd leave you to think about is if you're in a system or in a country, internet aside, where the information space is controlled, most people get their information from television, and television messages are controlled. You don't know if people support the government because you don't know what information they're getting, on what basis they actually support the policies of the government. And the second point is the evidence of that, of the importance of that point, is that this summer, when it became clear that Russia was intervening directly and militarily in eastern Ukraine, because sadly, dead Russian young men were being brought home. It really hit me. I was reading one of the reports of a burial of a 20-year-old young man and his mother lamenting this, and I have a 20-year-old son, and I thought I couldn't read anymore. But there were stories of this, and immediately the government cracked down on those who were reporting these stories. Immediately, the government cracked down on another one of the most well-respected Russian grassroots NGOs, Soldiers' Mothers. So it suggests that there is that diversity of view. There are Russians who want to consider whether this is the right course, and the current government does not want to allow that conversation to happen. So one needs to wonder what the popularity ratings of the government and the president would look like if there actually was the ability of Russian citizens to think about making their own choices for Russia's future.
Well, I do think this suggests a differing interpretation on the part of you two when it comes to the question of, are you giving Putin credit, in effect, for the lingering existence of some of the freedoms that occurred in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He has a pretty strong record, it seems to me, of trying to crack down pretty consistently on any independent sources of information that might threaten his rule. He has certainly not imposed something like the firewall of China. I'm not sure that changes our interpretation of his perhaps desire to do so. It might speak either to his ability to do so. Perhaps it might speak to perhaps he's become more sophisticated about what is necessary to achieve a high approval rating in society. What are the levers of information? At any rate, we want to make sure that we get a couple questions from the audience before we have to move on. Okay, we have lots of hands. Do give us a question and let us know who you are.
Thank you. Marty Jones from the World Affairs Council of Jacksonville. Russia has been rattling sabers about seizing foreign-owned assets, certainly strikes against Google, media companies. What is the position of, I want to say, the government right now along these lines? What if Russia goes ahead and passes, the bill in Parliament to seize foreign companies? Thank you.
Well, the U.S. government has, the duty to do what we can to protect American business interests in terms of their legal standing and their legal recourse. So, but in the end, these are private companies, and they have legal recourse, and they have pretty good lawyers, and they have their own capabilities. But what I would point out is I would point more to not what the American government would do, but why would the Russian government do this? They're having trouble attracting foreign investment as it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
capital is fleeing. Investors are not going into Russia right now. The Russian economy is unlikely to grow in the next couple of years and may even be in recession. Inflation has increased. The ruble, last I heard, was down to 45 to the dollar, which makes me think maybe I do need to make a visit to Moscow for some conversations, because there are some things I wanted to buy that I wasn't able to afford before, and now I can afford them. That would be an extraordinarily counterproductive step for the Russian government to take. In the end, they may do it, but I actually don't think that this is. I don't agree with the policies and the intentions and the actions of the Russian government. I think that they are counterproductive for the international community. But I think that that would be such an extraordinarily counterproductive step for Russia and the Russian economy that I wouldn't put that on the high likelihood end of the spectrum. Not impossible, but not high likelihood.
Hi, can you stand up? Thank you.
Is this on?
Yep.
I can hear you. I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Cindy Miller from the World Affairs Council, Greater Hampton Roads. America has a lot of interest across the world. We're trying to rebalance to China and proportion military forces accordingly. General Breedlove, the commander of EUCOM, just asked for more forces to help appease the nations and address the threat in Russia. Comments on that?
Angela?
I didn't know.
She's asking about U.S. military presence. Is it required? Do we need additional forces in Europe?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, we've already beefed up NATO's presence, in the Baltic states. We're doing more certainly with the Poles. I mean, the countries that feel most threatened by what's happened. I mean, one of the problems in NATO is that most of our NATO allies aren't willing to spend enough on defense, the minimum 2% that they should be spending in order to have more NATO forces there. And so that's one of the things, obviously, that General Breedlove and others would like to encourage them to do. But as you say, we have a number of other problems around the world, very pressing ones, particularly in the Middle East. And therefore, I think there's a limit, to what's feasible. The other idea is obviously to have a bilateral American, say, presence there, military presence there, without NATO. But there again, we'd like to get our NATO allies involved in this. So I think there's a challenge to really how much more we can do. And then there's always the question about to what extent, if you beef up the forces quite robustly, that then evokes a Russian counter-response.
We have a question here in the front.
Good morning. Angela Weck from the Peoria Area World Affairs Council. Thank you for joining us this morning. A two-part question. First, the argument that we should worry about where Russia's going in terms of its desires in Ukraine, Moldova, or Georgia, a counter-argument is that they've already accomplished what they wanted. They now have established countries with disputed borders, and that makes those countries more dependent upon Russia naturally. Is that a valid argument? And the second part of that is tied to it. A number of our NATO partners in Eastern Europe, Hungary, for example, and elsewhere, have made comments that admire Putin. If NATO throws a party and nobody shows up, what's the problem? What effect would that have on Putin's ambitions for Europe?
So I think your analysis is correct, that the, if not creation, but exploitation of these unresolved conflicts. And I've always been leery about the term frozen because everyone was calling Abkhazia and South Ossetia frozen conflict until it became a hot conflict in 2008. So these unresolved conflicts are a source of instability and weakness, vulnerability, and constraint on the choices of these countries about their future, not just their future, do we join the EU or NATO, but their internal, reform, a political choice. And it may be the case that that was the Russian leadership's intention in eastern Ukraine. By annexing Crimea, in effect, the irony is annexing Crimea, you lose that ability to kind of create, in principle, because you've said it's now part of Russia. Eastern Ukraine is now, a very difficult situation for the government in Kiev, and does perhaps feed that kind of strategy. But that's small. That's not a good thing. You're not saying it's a good thing. There are other. For example, President Putin congratulated President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan for creating a country that had never existed before, which got a lot of attention in Kazakhstan because the population in northern Kazakhstan is not majority Russian, ethnic Russian, but very substantially, at least as much as eastern Ukraine. So where does it stop? You still have the question of where does it stop? Sorry, your second. I was thinking I was going to let Angela answer that one.
Well, I mean, what you point to something very important, which is Europe is hardly really united on this. I mean, Angela Merkel has done a terrific job of uniting the Europeans behind sanctions and things, but you see already fissures there, and Hungary being the most egregious one. Hungary is in the European Union, it's in NATO, its Prime Minister talks about illiberal democracy, basically, and has praised President Putin. Hungary doesn't want to go along with the sanctions. There are several other countries, Slovakia, and some others that are, that are beginning to break ranks. So I think we have to watch that. I think we have to watch, the Russian attempts to nurture these fissures within the European Union, which is certainly there, and that would diminish European solidarity on, having a common policy there.
We did have a question from Andrei Sitov, from the Russian news agency. No, I know, he came to.
Hi, thank you for doing this, and thank you, Susan, for remembering my name. My name is Andrei Sitov. I'm with TASS, the Russian news agency. I have maybe a couple of brief questions, but I did want to say, Celeste, the story about the boys in the soccer field being killed was a huge news item in Russia, because the boys were killed by the Ukrainian government, by their shelling. My question to Celeste is about a bill that is currently pending in the US Senate, and which aims to perpetuate the sanctions regime against Russia. And I wanted to ask whether the White House thinks it's a good idea. Because frankly, despite what's been described as mostly business as usual outside of sanctions, it's definitely not that. And I know that for the Russian side, they keep saying they want a normal relationship with the United States. But they cannot go on as usual against the background of sanctions. And my second question, more of a theoretical nature for all participants, is about this notion of facts and fictions. I recently heard from a senior government official here that American facts are facts and Russian facts are fictions. Which to me seems like a very bad foundation for having any sort of dialogue. So I wanted to ask Celeste why, for instance, Putin in his speech in Sochi directly challenged the United States to dispute his assertions. And we've done some of that here with Susan's help, but why can't we have a discussion where both sets of facts are recognized? Thank you.
So thank you. And I would like to, Andre has many times I've had the opportunity to sit down and discuss with him, and I've always appreciated the opportunity to do interviews for your service and and the respect with which you've always treated our relationship. So let me thank you for that. I really mean that. But this exemplifies the challenge, because and I would be happy to sit down with you with a map. Our analysis of that incident was that the shelling came from the so-called separatists. The closest Ukrainian forces were out of range of that soccer field. I believe that people in Russia believe what was reported by the Russian media, and that is now taken as fact. I respect that. But this is the challenge. This is exactly the challenge we face. I'm ready to sit down at any time and talk with you about the facts and bring facts to bear, but then, or you or colleagues from the Russian embassy. I speak often with Ambassador Kislyak. But then Russia has to bring actual facts and evidence, not claims, right? And so I think that would be a good idea. And maybe it would be a better thing for scholars to do. Angela is, always very busy in these sorts of things, but it might be a really useful exercise to do this sort of thing, because we're not going to be able to have a discussion about how can we work together unless we have a common set of facts to work from. And both sides have a duty to be able to provide evidence for their facts and not assume that the other side's facts is fiction. I entirely respect that, but I've spoken. The Senate, well, the White House never likes the Senate to be telling it what to do, so you can imagine what the White House thinks about any Senate bill that ties its hands in foreign policy. But more specifically on the issue of sanctions, we believe that sanctions are very much in the realm of executive authority, and that sanctions work best when they are designed and are most effective when they are very carefully targeted and calibrated, and in this case, when they are very closely coordinated, as they have been with our European allies and partners. And there is some concern that the approach adopted by the Senate would not allow us to preserve those aspects of the effectiveness of our sanctions. And again, I will just reiterate, the goal is not to keep the sanctions on. The goal is to get to a place where we can push toward push towards and achieve a real political resolution of the crisis. Oh, and just I did not mean to suggest that it's business as usual in our relationship with Russia. My point was that we are able to conduct business where it is very important and central to key national security priorities and where we have a global responsibility. But let me be clear, we do not believe it's business as usual because what we believe Russia is doing in Ukraine is not acceptable because it threatens the international order, so it can't be business as usual.
So we're pretty much out of time. I want to give John and Angela a chance to offer their final thoughts as well to Andre's question. Do we live in a world of two sets of facts? How can you have two sets of facts?
Yeah, we always live in a world of two sets of facts, and that's why tables were invented. So that people can sit down and discuss their sometimes conflicting views of the facts and come to something that we call consensus, or at least civilized agreement. Let me just say something in addition to what Celeste said about the Senate bill that is pending right now, as I understand it. The value of the economic sanctions that have been levied against Russia are in the flexibility that the administration has to turn them up and turn them down. When Congress legislates sanctions, they're much more of a straitjacket. And I think you need only look at the probably granddaddy of all sanctions against the Soviet Union, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which continued to exist long after the problem of Soviet Jewry's immigration to Israel had been solved. My concern about a long-term fix from the US Congress for what I hope is not a long-term problem in US-Russia relations is that it can actually be counterproductive and make the situation worse. So I very much support the administration and what the administration has done on sanctions, but I think we should all be worried about congressional legislation because it simply doesn't have the flexibility we need.
Angela, you had the first word and the last word.
Well, I mean, on the facts, I would say that we're now in a period of information war, really, between Russia and the West. We have a fundamentally different understanding of the facts, and therefore, of course, it's important to sit down and try and come to a common understanding of them, but it's rather difficult if the most basic question of what happened, you know, on night, for instance, of February the 21st, and then when President Yanukovych fled. I mean, we have such hugely different views of that. What's happened in this Ukrainian crisis is that there's a hybrid war going on in Ukraine. In other words, it's an undeclared war, and Russia still denies that there are any Russian troops there or it has anything to do with it. On the other hand, you know, we know the facts to be different, right? I won't even get into the MH17 question where the Malaysian Airlines crash, where obviously we have very different understanding of what happened. So if you have a hybrid war and you have all of these kind of gray zones where it's unclear what's going on and where kind of half-truths can then be you know, then established as facts, I would say, yes, of course, we have to try and sit down and come to a common agreement, but right now, we're just very far away from that.
A note to end on of realism. Thank you all very much for those questions. Thank you.